So let's talk a little bit more about adolescence by addressing some of the myths and realities that surround adolescence. Now, there's sort of like 5 myths about adolescence that are out there. First of all, one myth has to do more about just brain development, and this myth was largely the myth that lasted up until about the 1990s, and which was that all brain development really occurred in the first years of life. So people believed that the most important point of brain development, and pretty much the entire brain development, occurred in the early years of life, and we're going to soon see that that's not the case at all. That second thing was that, adolescents are just wild and they've lost their minds, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. It's all about those raging hormones. You'll hear this a lot said about adolescence and say, just try to explain everything that's strange about adolescence is about the hormones, or that they're just emotionally immature and they haven't matured yet. And 5, that adolescence itself is a cultural invention, that it's maybe something that the West developed fairly recently in recent decades to have a way of subscribing or saying what a particular time period of development was. Now let's take that last myth first, which is that adolescence is a cultural invention. Now, I'm going to grant you that in different cultures, when adolescence occurs and when it ends, and maybe some of the customs of adolescence are different in different cultures. But I think that the period of development, at least in the nervous system and the endocrine system, is really well defined, and it really does, it's not something that is just created by culture. In fact, if you go back 400 years ago to William Shakespeare, in The Winter's Tale, he wrote, "I would there were no age between 16 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there's nothing in between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing and fighting." So you can see 400 years ago, Shakespeare's character is saying that, between 16 and 23, well, I just wish that period could be skipped, or that youth would sleep it out because nothing happens except for a lot of sex, disregarding the wishes of their elders and doing a lot of stealing and fighting. So obviously, even back then, this was considered a very fraught period, adolescence. So how are we going to define adolescence? We're going to say that adolescence is the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, and physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. All right? So it's basically saying it starts with the onset of puberty and it ends with the person becomes obtains a stable, independent role in society. Now you'll notice that means then we don't really have a particular age when it actually occurs, and in some ways puberty, the onset of puberty, is actually happening earlier than it did just decades ago. It also says that you could be well into your 20s before adolescence is finished. Let's talk about some key facts about the adolescent nervous system. So going from myths now to facts. Some key things you should know just about the nervous system of adolescence. Now, key fact number 1 is that gray matter volume peaks in adolescence and then declines after that. Now, remember, the gray matter is the cell bodies and the dendrites, okay? So when you look at a scan of the brain and you can see it in terms of a picture, you'll see a lot of gray matter. The gray matter are those cell bodies and the dendrites. And we see that gray matter peaks at adolescence, and it peaks a little bit earlier for girls than it does for boys, as you can see in this diagram, and then it starts to drop off. What's happening after that point? Well, it has to do with pruning of neurons. You see, there are 2 kind of main growth spurts in our nervous system. The first one happens in utero, when our fetus is developing. So from in utero to about 18 months of age, there's an overproduction of cells in the brain and an overproduction of connections between all those neurons. And so we get a lot of neurons that are being created during that particular time period. And then there's a second growth spurt that happens again between the ages of 10 and 13. And you again see a lot of these cell bodies being formed and these neurons. And so that represents this peak that you see in this graph. Interestingly, during that age period of 10 to 13, you don't see a lot of emotional problems. So it's not that the extra cells in the brain is actually what's causing all the problems of adolescence. In fact, most people think of that period when the neurons are actually being produced as a latent stage. That is, it seems fairly quiet in development. Now, after this peak, what we see then throughout adolescence is a lot of pruning and organizing of the neural pathways. There's a phrase that people use when they talk about adolescent brain development, which is use it or lose it. That is, if certain neurons and certain pathways are not being used at that particular time, it's very likely that the neurons will have programmed cell death, and the neuron will actually just die and then be reused for other purposes in the brain. And this happens mostly during sleep. Okay, so you get this laying down of neural pathways and the pruning of neurons happening during adolescence. Key fact number 2 is that white matter is increasing during adolescence. Now, what is white matter? Now, white matter is really the myelination of axons. And so it's happening as along all those axons that have been making connections between different neurons, myelination is happening at a very great rate. And as it happens along each of the axons, as your neurons create these myelinated areas along the axon, it increases the speed that an action potential can travel. And in fact, it increases it like 100 times. So it's very much increasing the speed at which these messages can be passed among the neurons. The refractory period of the neuron also becomes 30 times shorter. And you remember that the refractory period is that time before the neuron can fire again. So it's actually speeding up the rest period. Like it's not going to rest as long there before it fires again with this myelination. Interestingly, by the way, myelination continues well into middle age. And so we keep doing this from adolescence onward, but it sort of starts really at a great rate during adolescence. Key fact number 3. There is some neurogenesis during adolescence. Now, you remember I told you that there was these great increases of cell bodies that happens at, from fetal time to about 18 months of age, and then again between 10 and 13. But there continues to be some neurogenesis that happens during adolescence. So some neurons in the hippocampus and maybe elsewhere, including the limbic system, are being created even after all that original development. I'm trying to point out, though, that neurogenesis isn't as great as it was at earlier stages, and it's just happening at different places at different times. So it starts to modestly decline after adolescence. So you continue to have neurogenesis well through adulthood, but the rate of neurogenesis is going down after adolescence is over. Okay, so that means that we do have some new neurons being formed during adolescence, but it's not to any great extent. Key fact number 4 is that neuroplasticity happens a lot during adolescence. And this kind of goes back to the last fact and back to key fact number 1, which is that, the nervous system is reorganizing its structure, its functions, and its connections through neuroplasticity. And this is happening a lot during adolescence. That we get these changes in the external and the internal environment, and by internal environment, I mean, for instance, hormones, that affect neural pruning and strengthening. So it's not so much that the neuron itself dies. It could also be that you have synaptic pruning, where certain synapses are cut back and pruned. Or there could be other synapses that are going to be connected and are strengthened through neuroplasticity. As a result of all this pruning, the synaptic pruning, neurons dying, and so on, and this strengthening of also other connections, what it means then is that adolescents are learning fast. They have a lot of synaptic plasticity that goes on during this period. And so they can quickly acquire from their environment, from these experiences they have, lots of new information, new behaviors, and so on. It's also interesting is that addiction occurs more easily during this period too. And it turns out that people who end up getting addicted, like for instance to cigarettes or to drugs during adolescence, have a harder time getting rid of it later on. Because of all of this sort of strengthening and this pruning that's happening there, you kind of like learn very efficiently to how to be addicted to whatever that particular drug is. I had a father who, my dad actually learned to smoke in his teens and had such a hard time all the way up into his death when he was nearly 80. He was still trying to get rid of his smoking habits, but his smoking had started back when he was a teen. It was just very hard for him to ever get rid of that addiction. And the other thing that's important is that the link between stress and depression is going to be stronger now too. And so you remember that the hippocampus, for example, keeps track of your stress and the events that are occurring around stress. And so you actually start to learn more about changes in your environment and what causes you to be stressed and what you have control over and so on. And so that kind of learning perhaps is going to make it easier for a person to make a connection between stress and depression. So it becomes more difficult then to kick as we get older because of these links that are developed during adolescence. All right, let's move on to key fact number 5, and that is the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature. And some people believe that this is actually what signals the end of adolescence, is when your frontal cortex is finally fully mature. That means that not only is it the last part of the brain to fully mature, it means that the brain itself is the last organ in the body to mature, which means then that our brain doesn't fully develop for about 2.5 decades. So around the time we're 25, we can kind of maybe rest assured that our brain is done maturing. But even in the brain, that means that the frontal cortex, the front part of our brain, is the last part of the brain to mature. That it actually starts more towards the back of the cortex, back in the occipital lobe, the temporal parietal lobes. They're going to develop and mature more quickly than the frontal cortex is. And the frontal cortex then is that last part of the brain to mature. So what are the consequences of that? What does it mean to have our frontal cortex not fully mature by a time we're reaching adolescence? Well, you have to keep in mind that the frontal cortex is where executive functioning takes place. And as I said, it's the last to develop, and executive functioning is quite important to our everyday life. Executive functioning is where the brain is really controlling our activation, our initiation of behavior, our arousal levels, our effort. So, getting started on a task, paying attention, finishing work, it's all going to really depend a lot on your executive functioning. It also is where emotion is going to be controlled, so it's going to help us to tolerate frustration. It's going to help us to think before we act or speak on our emotions. And also executive functioning, you can kind of think of it as being involved in the analysis of issues that might be presented to us. So it helps us to take issues apart, analyze them, and maybe organize new ideas from the issues that are brought up to our attention. So without a fully developed frontal cortex, we don't have a fully developed executive functioning center here. And so a lot of these functions that you see listed here are going to be hindered. They're not going to be fully developed, and they're going to be more difficult for the adolescent brain. So those are my 5 facts about the adolescent nervous system: that gray matter volume peaks in adolescence and then declines after that, that white matter increases during adolescence, that there's some neurogenesis during adolescence, neuroplasticity happens a lot during adolescence, and finally the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature.